Hi, I'm Jane Hutchin, and in July 2010 I created 1+1, and up until September 2019 recorded nearly 500 interviews. In this series, I'm bringing together my top 10. They're the conversations which have taken me by surprise or somehow had an impact on me. I hope you enjoyed this interview with cartoonist Michael Leunig. Michael Leunig, welcome to 1+1. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah.
Michael, I'm dying to know, as a cartoonist, does your editor tell you what he'd like to see, or do you have a complete free rein?
Oh, these days, I suppose it's a free rein. They've given up on me, and I think when you're older than the editor, things change a bit, and I seem to be older than everyone, including the President of America and the Prime Minister of Australia, so freedom, I think. Yeah, they leave me alone.
Wow. So in those times where you've created more controversial cartoons, do you ever look back and think, yes, I've absolutely nailed that, and I know what kind of a response I'm going to get?
I really think I've nailed it, but because I don't like nailing things down too much, I like to open them up a bit, you see. So that's the odd part of a lot of my work. It ends on a question rather than a punchline. So yes, there's predictable outrage, as it's known in the media, you know. But honestly, the most difficult upsets I've caused have been unbeknownst to me. I thought I was saying something that was a truth, or I was quite innocent about it, genuinely, because you go into the world of creating this thing and you forget that this is not conventional.
So could you give me an example where something that you thought was small or non-existent had caused hurt?
Well, the world is easily hurt, and I don't like to hurt, because I don't like being hurt myself, but it is my work to probe at the tender spots, because they're the most important things sometimes. Where it is most important, it is most tender and fragile. In a recent time, I touched upon the subject of immunisation, and rather innocently, I thought, because I wanted to point to the fact that in our great tradition of parenting and mothering, that the mother has a really profound instinct which is held very strongly about what happens to her child. And I think I was trying to point to that and give that honour that a bit, and saying, look, we shouldn't bully people too hard and too fast into submitting to medication that they feel uneasy about. We should just do it more gently and without this force. So I thought I was saying something that was self-evident, that it's a human rights issue, and let us just consider and not go too hard on people. Well, you just touch a landmine there, and soon you're seen as an anti-vaxxer or something. They put a label on you, and then you get kind of pilloried and dragged through the mud. But I mean, that's my job too. You know, the work of the cartoonist is to represent those who are underrepresented, or not. I don't represent the power establishment or the wealthy or the well-armed or the well-informed or the beautiful people. I'm representing the others, and that's the tradition of cartooning, and I think that's a great tradition. I'm an outsider.
You were born in Footscray. I think you had 4 siblings, so there were 5 children. Your dad worked in the meatworks.
He did, yeah.
And you describe in one of your essays how he sharpened his knives, and how he lovingly said to you one time that he could shave a sleeping mouse.
Yes.
What sort of things went through your head when he said that?
Well, you know, to see him sharpen a knife over the kitchen sink, ready for work the next day, and then he would sort of pull up his sleeve and he'd run the blade down the hairs on his arms, and they'd just come off, you see, like this. Well, a little boy is awestruck to see a knife so sharp. And so he said, yes, this would shave a sleeping mouse. Well, the humour in that and the kind of sensuality of that thought was wonderful. And my father had a terrific turn of phrase quite often.
When you were a little boy, you had an accident one time while you were playing in, I think it was a rubbish dump.
Yeah.
And you fell badly and you hurt your leg very severely. And you had to actually lie in bed for some time.
Well, I was burned. I fell into a pit, a hole where the fire had burned in it some car tyres, and the fire had died down, and it just looked like level ground, but underneath was burning red-hot coals all tangled up in wire, and I stepped in it and went down to my knee and was stuck there momentarily, and a cousin I was with dragged me out, and it was a horrific injury because the pain was excruciating, and I remember looking at my legs, and the skin was peeling back, and I pulled it all off like a stocking. It was horrific. And so a burns injury is a very difficult and complex thing. And he got me to a doctor on a Saturday afternoon. There weren't many doctors around in Footscray at that time available. And I spent a lot of time in bed, recovering and in a lot of pain, and sort of cut off from the world. I could hear children playing outside, and the sun would be shining, and I couldn't be with them.
By the time you reached year 12, what happened there?
Well, I failed. I failed the big exam at the end. And that was sad because a lot of my friends went on to university, and I had a choice to leave and get a job or to repeat. So I repeated, and I sat for year 12 again, and I failed even worse the second time. So I wasn't meant for education in the formal sense, it was clear. And you know, what I do is self-taught. You can't learn it.
How did you feel when you failed year 12 for a second time? Was that hard for you to take?
I accepted it in good grace, I think, but I thought I was intelligent, you see. I thought I was bright enough to pass, and I couldn't understand it. I felt a bit ashamed of myself for, you know, having failed, but it was okay. It was okay. I started going into factories. I worked in factories and things. I worked in the meatworks.
That's right. You were working in an abattoir and saw up close the killing of animals.
I had to do it. I was a labourer, and I would be assigned to do this job or that job, and just after the lunch break I'd be assigned to spend about an hour with another guy, and we'd be killing cattle. It sounds brutal to say it so casually, I was killing cattle, but I've often thought, look, it was a very life and death experience working in the meatworks, and I was a sensitive boy, and if it brutalises some, it sensitises others. So there's a lot of time to reflect. And of course, my culture ate meat and I ate meat. And I thought, okay, and just be good at it, do it quickly and don't get it wrong. So, and it wasn't very long that I stayed in the meatworks, but I did experience that. And that's a humbling experience and very sobering experience to do that.
You were given an opportunity to work on a newspaper. Yeah. I think it was 1969.
Yes.
It was The Age?
It was. They started an evening newspaper called Newsday.
What do you think it was that made the editor give you that job?
Yeah, I don't know to this day. He might have had too much to drink or something, but the point was, I'd been profoundly concerned about the Vietnam War. I was conscripted. I'd sort of thought about it and studied it, which was unusual at that time for a young man to be interested in that. And I resisted very strongly, and I was part of a resistance movement to conscription. And so within that I started drawing little cartoons for what we called underground publications back then, and little like student type newspapers, protest things. And this was the 60s, you know, it was a great kind of a
awakening, that's right.
It was a genuine renaissance, and there was that music driving it all, and there was new printing techniques which meant you could make little magazines quite cheaply and easily. And so that's how I started.
Some years later, you were sent to Canberra for a kind of education. And you were there, actually, when Gough Whitlam was sacked in 1975.
I was in Parliament House, yes.
I wonder, did that era... I mean, I suppose that was a real education, because a lot of us don't see how Canberra works.
No, well, that Canberra and that Parliament House then was quite astonishing. I mean, the security wasn't like it is now, nowhere near. And politicians were far more accessible. The press gallery was such a wild, organic, woolly sort of place. There were dynamic kind of characters, and I was an innocent. Even though I'd been in the meatworks, compared to Canberra, was very strong experience, and I saw close up what happened after he was sacked, and that day, and all the drama that unfolded, how the staff, the ministerial staff members thought there was it was a conspiracy, and they thought, we've got to get the documents of government out of here and hide them away. So I watched and sort of took part in the removal of cartons coming out of ministerial offices, loaded into boots of cars that were driven up, and they were taken off to houses all around Canberra. And to this day, what happened to those documents? I'm talking about masses of documents.
Wow.
They felt it was as if they were going to have to be a government in exile or something like that. Such was the paranoia and the alarm at the time. And I remember staying with a press secretary of the Minister for Defence at the time, and I, in the morning after this big, party that night in a restaurant there, a sort of a wake, you would say, I remember I got up early in the morning and I went into the bathroom and I opened the door and it was just stacked to the ceiling with documents from the Minister's office, the Minister for Defence.
Wow.
So it was like that. It was wild and woolly.
So I wonder how that era influenced your thinking about the whole process of politics.
I don't know. Maybe it made me see the human side of it, that these were just the ministers, the politicians and their staff were flawed human beings. They were people whose lives were in upheaval just like everybody else. I just felt such a babe in the woods, and I couldn't possibly understand the depths of it all. But that's a cartoonist. A cartoonist is not an insider. A cartoonist is, I think, by definition, an outsider. Not a sort of resentful outsider or a bitter outsider. It's just the perspective, a position of not having a vested interest in the thing, but having a higher interest in civil society and, still a civilised human being, but not down in that squalor of and the tangle of politics, which gets so narrow and tiny sometimes.
Has your creativity ever failed you? Have you ever felt a complete sense of drawing block? If I don't know whether you call it writer's block or cartoon block.
Yeah, that's a fair description. Well, of course I have. I mean, I must say every piece of work that I've ever done that I've liked has been a struggle. It's hard. There's no technique. You start the process with a blank piece of paper and a blank mind and all the ruminations and thoughts that have been going through your head about your society and the world. There's a philosopher ticking away, trying to make sense of it and find out what matters. The press decides what matters. They set the agenda, what the main game is and all the same old things. But I'm outside of that and I'm thinking, what is not being looked at? What is really important that is not being attended to? So that has been my work. And that's difficult because it's very lonely work. It's very lonely. And you have no certainties and you have to work with a lot of intuition and instinct and caution yourself, and yet you've got to create.
And I guess you have to be fast as well at times.
You do, yes. I've underestimated the impact, as every deadline worker would underestimate the effect the accumulating effect, the stress. I mean, a deadline is called a deadline for a reason. There's a lot of death in the word, and people indeed, there's a lot of wear and tear. But it also, you have to have bravado and a bit of daring do, and that's where a bit of innocence is helpful. And if you thought about the enormity of it, of what you're doing when you're offering something into the public, if you thought too much, you might not do it.
I'm sure I can hear a tap dripping.
It's not a tap. It's my heart.
There is a vein of melancholy or sadness that comes through in your work.
Yes.
And I wonder what drives that?
Well, the world and myself, we're up to our neck in melancholy and sadness. We live in grief too.
You personally?
Yeah, and I don't know a person who doesn't somewhat, except that our culture is interested in the happy side. A little too much, I think. It's natural to be joyous, to seek the sunshine, to be happy and glad. But I think there's a great repression of this very profound and serious side of life. And I think the artist's work is to express what is repressed. Express what is repressed. Not just in self, but in your society, in your community, in others, and speak on behalf of other people's grief. The grief of, the normal grief of losing loved ones, but losing one's youth, losing relationships, etc., and divisions within families cause grief, etc., etc. And even to watch nature be so impacted by human development, and to watch the loss of beauty in your world. These are things we experience, and they needn't cripple us, they needn't destroy us. We have to just, but I think we're better if we face them, find the language for talking about it. But I mean, this is biblical, it's Shakespearean, it's the work of poets, of the songwriters. This is just so traditional, this work, and they say it on behalf of the world that's a little embarrassed about the language of sadness and the language of grief, but it's within us all. So I look upon it as simply the work of an artist, and it's noble work in a sense, and great things come of it.
Can you tell me something that's challenged you recently?
So much.
Really?
Yeah, so much. There's sadness in my life recently. A number of events. It probably would take too long to string them out, but I did suffer a very sort of severe brain injury, and and the consequences of that were quite profound, existential, like you lose your identity for a while, and you lose the sense of who you are or what's happened, and it was a near-death experience basically. And
this was last year, wasn't it?
It was, it was 18 months ago, and I'm still coming out of that. And there's a sadness in that, and then this causes disruption. There's been disruption in my family, probably as a consequence of it, and as sometimes happens with tragedies or kind of radical, where people, for instance, lose a child. Sometimes it breaks a marriage up, things like that. You think, how does that happen? Well, I think severe injury does that too, and it affects things rebound, and I'm probably at an age where you do reflect, and one's sensitivity increases, I find in my case, and you see losses in the world. The world is in a chronic state in many respects. We look at political leaders who just appall us and shock us, and there's a sense of the world's growing madness. You hear this talked about, or a sense that things have gone awry, things are going chaotic. So that's grief in that, you see. That too is a hurtful thing.
I recently saw a cartoon that was drawn by your sister Mary,
Yeah.
where she was shooting you through the bottom.
Yeah. I saw that eventually. That sort of thing, I cannot.
It hurt.
I cannot comprehend. I cannot. It hurt. It hurt. Not so much like, oh, she's insulted me, but what is going on in her mind, you see? So you're not meant to think these things about your siblings. You're meant to always be close friends and stuff. And when you just see it and shake your head, and I don't know, it's a very lonely feeling. And I think it was, why hurt me like that? Why do you hurt me? Why do you try to hurt me? And look, to work in the public sphere, as you may know, as many people know, to put yourself forward or find yourself in that sphere. I never aimed to do this. I just gradually trickled into, it's a small thing. It's like a musician. They start playing a song on the street, next thing they're on the stage. And suddenly critics and people have a view of you, and people want to shoot you down too. And people get envious, or they imagine you're having a life that they deserve, or whatever. All the complexities, you come in for a lot of hurt.
So have you had a conversation with your sister?
No, I haven't. Sadly, there's been, my family, I had a pretty good, robust, working class childhood with my sisters and my mother and father. It was lively. They gave me much. They gave me a lot. Alas, in the later stage in midlife, I became basically an exile from my family.
Really? So they shunned you?
I would say so. I would say I was shunned, and here's a funny thing. Why?
Yes.
Because I didn't steal a family silver, or I can't put it down to anything. It's the stuff of psychology and emotion, which is unfathomable at times, and I think it came along with becoming known in the public's realm. And I think in my working class background, there's that kind of tall poppy thing that you are not one of us anymore. You think you're better than us. I felt that could have had something to do with it somewhere, that I was mixing with the different people. And I wasn't. I kept my feet on the ground, and I still do.
But it's interesting that your work is so strong in terms of putting compassion and empathy and connection out there for people to see.
I hope so.
And yet, in your own family life, you haven't had that conversation yet?
Look, I have great fond memories of my mother and father, who are now gone. No, I can't find the lines of communication. As I make myself open, I can't find it. I don't understand it. I really don't. I have a brother who I'm close to, but my sisters, I don't know, it saddens me. Why? What are they lost in? But I don't think this is unusual in families. But it's a terrible thing, because as I once heard, I was listening to the car radio, and I heard that piece of classical music had been played, and the announcer translated the lyric to the song, and it was from Goethe, the German philosopher, and it said, "Who can understand the pain of a man when balm has turned to poison?" And so that means, and I burst out crying. This is quite some time ago, this is years ago, and it was that which should be nourishing and warm, balm, is poison, when that becomes poisonous to you. And the pain and the grief and the hurt of that is unfathomable. You can't make sense of it, and it's just an ache which is not to be healed in some ways. It is eventually to be accepted, which I have accepted. and I accept it through recognising the nourishment that was given at the important beginning and the great sacrifice and care that was given to me back then, and those joyous times of childhood.
Michael, one of the questions that people often ask you is that they don't understand a particular character or what's the duck about or something like that. Do you like that?
I'm at peace with it because I think we don't have to understand things to like them. And in fact, when I did my first duck cartoon on an otherwise, I should have been doing something about politics, and I presented, right on the deadline, I presented it to the editor. This is back in 1969. And he said, "Oh, Michael, I don't understand that, but I like it." he said, "But I like it." And so I think a little mystery, a little poem, a little lyricism is really enriching for people, you know.
Michael, do you feel satisfied by your body of more than 40 years of work?
Oh, that's a funny question. Some days I think, oh, I did my best. This is appalling. I love that one. And then tomorrow I'll think differently. I'll say, oh, the one I think is appalling yesterday, I now laugh today. And I sometimes forget that I am essentially a humorist also.
Are you optimistic?
I've never been optimistic. I'm enthusiastic. I think I don't understand optimism. It's just a life force. If you've got eros running through your veins, you don't need to think about optimism. You just live, and you just have the spirit of life in you, and you're keen for it. But we live in a time of, you know, very sharp surveillance and critical analysis and hostility and kind of it's a harsh environment now. You can be ticked off by the wardens of culture and propriety and, as they say, political correctness. But I think, oh, I don't want to hurt people, but really, you've got to keep your spirit up and be forgiving too. And I don't think I'm in a position of power. It's a cartoon, a drawing after all. I mean, it's only a drawing of a duck.
Well, whoever said even a duck paints 1,000 words was absolutely correct. Michael Leunig, it's been such a great pleasure. Thank you for speaking with me on 1+1.
Thank you, Joan. It really has been a pleasure.
And that's one of my top 10. Thanks for watching. You can watch again on iView. See you next time.